What if I told you the emperors who ruled the greatest empire in history did so not just with armies or laws, but with sex? Behind the pristine marble of Roman palaces were rooms of horror where bodies became currency and lust a language of domination. From incestuous weddings to state-sponsored brothels, these emperors didn't hide their depravity. They turned it into theater. And tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtain. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to discover will leave you breathless. They called him Caligula, the little boot. But what he lacked in stature he made up for in madness. Crowned young, hailed as Rome's golden boy, he was supposed to be the beacon after Tiberius's tyranny. Instead, Caligula would turn the imperial palace into a playground of humiliation. His sisters were not family to him. They were lovers, trophies, proof that even blood could be bent beneath power. At feasts, he would place them beside him in the seats of empresses, letting whispers ripple through the Senate floor. But when Drusilla, the sister he favored most, died, his grief became grotesque. He declared her a goddess and criminalized joy during mourning. Laughing became punishable by death. But this was only the beginning of his descent. Not content with controlling his family, Caligula began a new project, the transformation of the palace into what historians now call the House of Pleasure. A brothel hidden in plain sight. Its workers, the wives and daughters of senators forced into service to entertain Rome's elite, or shame them beyond recovery. Imagine being summoned to the palace only to find your wife dressed in silk kneeling beside an imperial slave. And then, being forced to watch. Caligula charged admission to these performances. He profited not only in coin, but in obedience. Every scream and moan echoed the message the emperor owns everything, even you. Then there was Incitatus Caligula's horse, who was granted a marble stall servants and, allegedly, a seat in the Senate. Some say it was satire. Others believe it was a twisted message. A beast more dignified than the politicians of Rome. A creature Caligula could trust more than men with swords and scrolls. But the madness did not die with Caligula. Before him stood Tiberius, a man whose later years were spent in self-exile on the island of Capri. An island that would become a stage for acts too depraved to believe. Among the cliffs and caves, Tiberius created a sanctuary for sin. Roman historian Suetonius described what he saw: pools carved into rock, filled not with water, but with little fishes, young boys and girls stripped of name, of future, of voice. They were trained to entertain the emperor in his baths, performing obscene acts that the Senate dared not speak of, at least not while Tiberius lived. The walls of Village Ovis bore murals of graphic pleasures. The chambers echoed with forced laughter and muffled cries. But this wasn't pleasure, it was policy. Many of the victims were children of Rome's nobility. Their degradation was not just for satisfaction, it was leverage. A senator whose child suffered in silence would think twice before raising his voice in defiance. When Tiberius died, there were no tears in the streets. Rome exhaled. But their relief would be short-lived, because rising from the ashes came Caligula. And with him a new empire not built on laws or glory, but on flesh, fear, and a love for power no boundary could contain. But Rome hadn't seen the worst yet. In the year 218 AD, a new ruler ascended the throne only 14 years old, draped not in a toga, but in silk and perfume. His name was Elagabalus. To some, he was the high priest of a foreign sun god. To others, he was the empire's final insult to decency. But to history, he became something far more complex, a teenage emperor who shattered every norm of Roman masculinity. Elagabalus appeared at public events in dresses, wore elaborate makeup, and adorned himself with emeralds and pearls. He didn't merely bend gender, he obliterated it. He referred to himself with feminine pronouns, demanded to be called lady, and sought out physicians across the empire offering them fortunes if they could give him female genitalia. the emperor married not one, but multiple men. His most public union was with a charioteer named Heracles. In ceremonies meant to mimic traditional weddings, Elagabalus played the bride, allowed himself to be publicly dominated, and bestowed titles on his lovers that were once reserved for imperial wives. Rome gasped, and then Rome trembled. But the most sacred line Elagabalus crossed wasn't political, it was religious. He married a Vestal virgin, a priestess sworn to 30 years of chastity, believed to guard the fate of the empire with her purity. To violate her was more than taboo, it was a metaphysical crime. And yet he paraded her through the streets, proclaiming a new kind of divinity, one born not of restraint, but of desire unleashed. Behind the palace walls, the emperor played prostitute. He built a private brothel inside his own imperial residence, dressed as a courtesan, and sold himself to men who came knocking. But they weren't just buying pleasure, they were buying power. To sleep with the emperor was to enter a new political order, one where shame became currency. Senators could not comprehend what they were witnessing. In Roman culture, to dominate sexually was to rule. But here was the ruler, being ruled. His submission upended the very logic of Roman authority. If the emperor could be penetrated, could he truly command legions? Could he still command fear? The answer, it seemed, was no. In 222 AD, the Praetorian Guard dragged Elagabalus and his mother through the streets and murdered them in a public latrine. His body was mutilated, thrown into the Tiber River. But the memory of his reign lingered like a perfume too strong to wash off. A warning, perhaps, that even Rome had limits until Nero arrived. Nero Claudius Caesar, a name drenched in decadence. He began his rule at 17, and while the Senate hoped for stability, Nero brought performance. He blurred the line between politics and theater, turning Rome itself into his stage. But the plays he wrote were not comedies. They were tragedies, soaked in blood and semen. One day, Nero saw a beautiful boy named Sporus. The boy reminded him of his deceased wife Poppaea, who had died pregnant after Nero kicked her in a fit of rage. Driven by grief or madness, Nero castrated Sporus, dressed him as a woman, and married him in a full imperial ceremony. Rome watched in silence as their emperor kissed his new bride in the Forum. He called Sporus Sabina, forced him to wear makeup and gowns, and took him everywhere to games banquets, even temples. But this wasn't love. This was resurrection through mutilation, a grotesque attempt to undo guilt with violence, to rewrite memory with flesh. And it wouldn't be the last time Nero turned trauma into spectacle. Nero's appetite for performance spilled beyond the palace. He constructed grand theaters not just for plays, but for himself. Dressed in costumes of gods and goddesses, he sang, danced, and sometimes simulated sexual acts on stage. Senators were forced to attend and applaud. Not clapping could mean death. The empire's dignity was held hostage by the emperor's lust for attention. But his most scandalous display of submission came in another wedding. This time, Nero played the bride. In a public ritual, he wed a freedman named Pythagoras, who played the groom. Before thousands, Nero knelt, wore a veil, and pledged obedience. Then, during a mock ceremony, Pythagoras symbolically penetrated the emperor. The line between satire and state collapsed completely. If Rome laughed, it did so quietly. Because Nero's Rome wasn't a republic of ideas, it was a circus of fear. Any objection to his sexual theater could be branded treason. Even whispers of discomfort were met with disappearance. Power in Nero's world was a performance. And resistance? Just a bad script edited out permanently. But perhaps the darkest rumor surrounding Nero wasn't about his husbands, it was about his mother, Agrippina the Younger. Strong, ambitious, and politically savvy, she had helped Nero claim the throne. And some say she claimed something more. Ancient sources whispered of incest, that Nero not only slept beside his mother but inside her bed, her body. Historians still debate the truth. But what we know is this Nero had her murdered, strangled and stabbed her body, discarded as a threat to imperial authority. He might have loved her. He might have hated her. But in the end she was like all things in Nero's world, disposable, and her death only added fuel to Rome's burning shame. Then came Valeria Messalina, not an emperor but the wife of one. Married to Emperor Claudius, she wielded her sexuality like a blade. Unlike other imperial women, she didn't wait for permission. She hunted often in disguise. At night, she would slip out of the palace, don a blonde wig, and enter the city's brothels as a common sex worker. But she wasn't common. She was extraordinary. In one legendary contest, Messalina challenged Rome's top prostitute Sylla to see who could bed more men in a single night. Sylla gave up at 23. Messalina finished at 25, and then asked for more. This wasn't hedonism. This was conquest. One body at a time. Her escapades weren't limited to anonymous pleasure. Messalina used sex as a political tool. She seduced senators, generals, even foreign diplomats, building a secret web of loyalty and blackmail. She knew every secret whispered in bed, and she used them all to extend her reach beyond Claudius's shadow. But ambition has limits. When Claudius learned that Messalina had secretly married her lover Gaius Silius in a public ceremony with full religious rites, he snapped. In Roman law, this wasn't just infidelity, it was treason. She wasn't replacing a man in her bed. She was trying to replace an emperor. The order was swift. Messalina was dragged into the gardens where she had once entertained lovers and executed on the spot. No trial, no last words, just silence. Her reign of lust had ended, but her legend only grew. In a world where men turned sex into violence, she had made violence out of sex, and history never forgave her for it. Rome's depravity wasn't confined to palaces or bedrooms. It became policy. With every conquest, Roman legions brought more than swords, they brought violation. Sexual violence against the conquered wasn't a crime. It was a military tactic, a way to humiliate, dominate, and erase entire cultures through flesh. Emperors like Titus and Trajan institutionalized this cruelty. Cities that resisted Roman rule were punished not only with fire, but with the forced submission of their women and sometimes their men. Soldiers celebrated not just victory but possession. The screams of the defeated were music to imperial ears. The spoils of war included people. The imperial household swelled with enslaved boys and girls, bought, paraded, and displayed like exotic pets. Eunuchs especially became symbols of refinement, their castrated bodies deemed safe, beautiful, and useful. A child's mutilation was now a mark of luxury. An entire industry emerged. Across the empire, traders scoured poor villages seeking young boys to castrate and sell to noble houses. The procedure was brutal. Most didn't survive. But those who did were trained as musicians' servants and sex slaves. Rome's appetite for submission knew no age. Legal protection. There was none. Roman law explicitly stated that slaves had no sexual rights. They could not say no. They could not accuse. They could only obey. And when the master was emperor, even silence was a form of complicity. Every moan became a hymn to empire. But the cruelty wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. Emperors merged sex with religion, transforming lust into liturgy. The cult of Priapus, god of fertility, rose in prominence. Temples erected with towering phallic symbols, ceremonies where men and women offered their bodies to the divine and to the state. Sacred prostitution flourished. In temples of Venus and Sibyl, priestesses and priest boys engaged in ritual sex with worshippers. Emperors would attend sometimes as observers, often as participants. To sleep in these temples wasn't a sin, it was an offering, a communion of flesh. Elagabalus took it further. He imported the Syrian sun god Elgabal, built a grand temple in Rome, and declared himself its high priestess. He wore bridal gowns, painted his lips, and invited male worshippers to share in holy union. The altar became a bed, the ritual a climax. These ceremonies weren't private. They were spectacles. Crowds watched, some in awe, others in disgust, as the emperor reenacted divine penetration. This wasn't mere blasphemy, it was power rewritten. If the gods could change form, why couldn't Rome? If holiness required surrender, then surrender became sacred. Bacchanalian rites, originally Greek, were transformed into orgies of empire. Wine flowed, clothes vanished, hierarchies dissolved in sweat. Emperors moved among the bodies, neither above nor below, but within. In that tangled mass of limbs, Rome found both its ecstasy and its moral collapse. But what began as worship always ended in politics. Every sexual act, no matter how sacred or profane, reinforced the same message: the emperor owns your body, your god, your shame. In Rome, pleasure wasn't private. It was weaponized, and the empire's bed became its throne. The senators knew it. The generals knew it. Even the poets whispered it. The closer one came to the emperor's touch, desired or not, the closer one danced to power. For some it meant fortune, for others ruin. But for all it meant submission disguised as invitation. And through it all, the people watched. Sometimes horrified, sometimes entertained. Always silent. Because Rome, like all great empires, thrived not just on force but on complicity. What was witnessed in the palace became gossip in the marketplace. The grotesque turned into rumor, into myth, into legend. And legends in Rome never die. The tales of Nero's mock weddings, Caligula's incestuous orgies, Tiberius's living puppets on Capri, all were preserved not in hidden scrolls, but in official histories. Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio. Men who understood, if you want to understand a ruler, study who he sleeps with and how. Even centuries later, Roman sexual rituals left their mark. Medieval kings mimicked imperial orgies in secret. Popes inherited both the thrones and the appetites of emperors. And the idea that power justifies desire became embedded in European monarchy for generations to come. But the Roman model had a darker inheritance. It taught future tyrants that bodies could be used as warnings. That pleasure, once fused with punishment, created the most loyal kind of fear, and that the most effective violence is the kind that leaves no scars visible. The real horror wasn't the blood on the palace floor. It was the applause. The way Rome clapped as Nero kissed his castrated bride. The way priests bowed as Elagabalus moaned beneath temple candles. The way silence stretched after every scream until it became normal. And perhaps that's the most terrifying legacy of all, not the perversion of emperors, but the corruption of society. A civilization that taught itself not to look away. That confused decadence with divinity. That made gods out of men who had long since become monsters. Today, we marvel at the ruins, the columns, the statues, the golden busts. But stone can't scream. And marble doesn't remember what it was made to hide. The real history of Rome isn't written in Latin, it's etched into the bones of those whose names were never recorded. Because beneath the glory was horror. Beneath the empire was flesh. And beneath the crown was a curse, a twisted inheritance passed from ruler to ruler, bed to bed, century to century. Rome did not fall in a day. It rotted slowly, and it started in the dark behind closed doors. And yet even after the empire crumbled, its shadows stretched long. The Byzantine court carried on rituals eerily reminiscent of Roman decadence. Empresses who seduced monks, eunuchs elevated to power, secret passages connecting churches to bedchambers. Rome may have changed its name, but not its hunger. Western Europe inherited more than just roads and laws. The very architecture of monarchies from France to Spain echoed Rome's obsession with bloodlines and bodies. To rule meant to possess meant to consume. And too often that consumption was human. In medieval courts, whispers of secret pregnancies, hidden lovers, and ritual purity rites surfaced again and again. Queens forced into marriages with young heirs. Princes married to cousins as a divine bond. The deeper you look, the more Roman it all begins to feel, because the Romans had taught them the master rule control the body and you control the state. That's why Roman emperors didn't just indulge in twisted acts, they institutionalized them. Every pleasure had purpose, every humiliation a consequence, every scream an echo of empire. It's easy to call them mad, monsters, deviants, but maybe that's too simple. Madness can be dismissed. But what if their actions weren't madness at all, but policy? What if emperors used sex the same way they used war as a language of control? Then suddenly their depravity is no longer shocking. It's strategic, it's systemic. It's designed to infect every layer of Roman life, from the brothel to the temple, from the barracks to the Senate. And at the center of it all stood the emperor, not just a ruler, but a god of flesh. So, we must ask what makes an empire truly powerful. Is it legions? Or is it the silence of a people who learn to cheer when their dignity is taken? Rome didn't fall because of barbarians. Rome fell because it believed it was immortal, even as it consumed itself. And the saddest part, the bodies are gone. But the blueprint remains. History has a way of hiding repetition beneath different names. Today, we still see rulers who exploit, humiliate, and objectify, calling it tradition, law, or faith. Rome is dead, but its sins are alive. So, next time you walk past a Roman statue or marvel at an aqueduct, or speak a word of Latin-derived speech, remember the same empire that built wonders also broke people. The same hands that carved gods in marble, carved fear into the living. This isn't just history, it's a warning. That power, unchecked, unchallenged, will always drift toward the flesh, toward appetite, toward domination. Rome didn't teach us how to govern. It taught us how to rule through silence, spectacle, and shame. In the end, the most twisted sex lives of Roman emperors weren't just personal scandals. They were mirrors, reflections of a society that had stopped asking questions, a civilization that had traded morality for majesty, and citizens who had confused proximity to power with safety. The emperors changed, the rituals evolved, but the silence remained. The same silence that allowed a boy to be castrated and crowned as a bride. The same silence that watched a priestess be turned into a concubine. The same silence that applauded the orgies of gods in human skin. Because it wasn't just about lust, it was about fear, about loyalty, about empire. The imperial bed wasn't a place of love, it was a throne of control. To sleep there was to submit, to refuse was to disappear. And in Rome, there were many who disappeared. What began in bedrooms ended in borders. The abuse of flesh became the logic of conquest. If an emperor could violate his own people, what would he do to the world beyond the Tiber? Rome didn't just spread Latin and law, it spread the gospel of domination. And though the empire collapsed, its hunger survived. Through religion, through monarchy, through systems that praised power and punished resistance. Rome, in the end, didn't die. It evolved. It disguised its legacy beneath robes and rituals, cathedrals and courts. So, today we ask, what horrors are we turning a blind eye to? Now, what performances are we applauding that future generations will condemn? Are we truly different or just more discreet? The questions haunt the ruins, and they echo in our headlines. Because history doesn't repeat itself. It reveals itself in patterns and whispers, in stories we choose to ignore. The emperors are gone, but their blueprints remain, etched in marble, written in blood, and still very much alive behind modern doors. The empire of spectacle never ended. It just changed platforms. The craving for control never died. It just found new victims. And the silence, the most dangerous part, still fills every room where power goes unchecked. But there is a way to break it. To speak. To remember. To confront the truth behind the crown. This story wasn't just about Rome. It was about us. About what we accept, about what we fear, about what we excuse because it's wrapped in gold. So, if this journey disturbed you, let it. If it made you question history, good. Because darkness doesn't hide in shadows. It hides in plain sight in rituals, in traditions and systems built on centuries of pain. Like, share, and comment below. Let's unlearn the myths and unmask the monsters. Together, we pull back the curtain and see what power truly looks like.